Alrighty. Hi, welcome to Monday. And it does look like I needed to make the live on the YouTubies work before I could even start the stream, so fine, whatever. You caught me doing some research work, so I got to finish that up. And right now what I'm doing is I am quickly making note of, oh, that's not right. Oh no, yes it is right. 75. I'm still doing a lot of research on all of this stuff. Well, that didn't work. But that will. So 1971 for this. I am going to be doing some music plug-in making, but I wanted to finish this up since I was caught up in it. I can tell you what I learned. It's been a busy morning. I can tell you what I learned when I see chat again and finish working on this. Just got to copy a couple of these down. 71. And 72 for this. And let us move all these over here. Right on, and one more. Oh, don't be like that. Don't even. No, no. Get out. What the hell is your problem? Bloody hell. No, that's not right. Okay, 1978. We'll call that 78. Ireland Studios. Why is that not working? Arg! Where was my cursor? There was my cursor, you fool. Why do you do me like that? My technology is fighting me today. I do not know why it is showing an apparent caret where one does not belong. Save. Probably save this for further looking at. Clearly I can't do that now. Probably don't need to save this. Was the wrong, why am I going to save it when I can't? I'm not to be saving it. Was I saving that or did I derp it somehow? Let's pretend I didn't and then we'll go and do it again. Oh, it's refusing to let me. It's refusing to let me save. What the actual hell? It's breaking, it's dying, it's throwing up and blowing up and dying. But I can get there through saving a Google search for the thing, even if the website won't let me do that. This is very interesting. This is a timeline of Frank Zappa's... Oh, am I overloading? I'm overloading too easily. Let's fix the controls. This is a timeline of Mothers of Invention recording sessions that I need to dig through. Hey, Formigator, only now am I able to look at what the chat is doing. And here we have old Rupert Neve. Let me see if I can save these things or not. That's going to be a nope. What the hell? How about this? Yes. I'm going to have to get back to that. This is something I need to dig through because that is history of old Neve consoles, and I have learned a bunch of really interesting stuff. Do I have a search that takes me to that? Kinda. Let's do a dedicated search specifically for that. There we go. And that's at the top of the list, and since it's Google, it will let me save the search because that website wasn't letting me do it. I don't know why. Hey, Sound on Sound even reported on this. This is a detailed history of Neve consoles, which is very difficult to save or anything. Yeah, so it's been an interesting morning on the back of this stuff. Hey, Peter. So what I've been doing, let me just close some of these things. I have been going through a list of 1970s classic rock records. This takes up the entire screen. Trying to figure out what recording consoles are used for all of that stuff. Seeing as I need to get in and do versions of console that cover those bases. And it has led to much struggle. Like some stuff shows up, you know, like here's like what I'm dealing with, right? So a lot of this stuff I know about and or is even on the records, and I dug through my records, littering my desk with cardboard shrapnel from these very old things, and looked into, for instance, old Zappa records, trying to pursue the idea that there's a characteristic between, say, old Grateful Dead records, like Working Man's Dead, for instance, and Zappa's Fillmore East 1971, and or Zappa's 200 Motels and Van Morrison's Moondance. Because there's a bunch of that old American stuff that was recorded on these desks that became Quad 8 desks. And it has been said sometimes that Pink Floyd's The Wall was mixed on 3 Quad 8 desks hooked together. they're also used for quadraphonic mixes. So it is, let me see now. It's fairly likely that Overnight Sensation, Apostrophe, Roxy and Elsewhere, and One Size Fits All from Zappa were done on Quad 8. And that is because all of those were potentially released in literal quadraphonic, and Quad 8, of course, was designed to facilitate that. It was a film desk more than anything else. And it's not so much how many channels they had for my purposes, but what kinds of EQs there are and whether I can get a consistent sound going that's reminiscent of those EQs. Because like some kinds of EQs are, say, 3-band, different crossovers, the way they work, how much gain they get versus how much saturation they get. And then you've got stuff like the Trident A ranges, which were also likely, let me see, Helios was found in Island Studios. Helios is what you find in like Led Zeppelin albums, but also apparently Dire Straits, also apparently a bunch of Island Records stuff. Whereas the Trident A range is classic Tom Petty albums, Ziggy Stardust and the Spider from Mars, and Station to Station by David Bowie. Van Halen's Fair Warning. For that matter, Metallica's Master of Puppets. But I don't have that one to study. And as these things go, hey, thanks, Groove Q. You did hear Frank Zappa for Comas. The way all of these things work is the people who developed the consoles often want to associate stuff with the consoles that they had. So it becomes really difficult to work out what used what. Example. I did mention Zappa. I'm trying to work out what those early 70s records came off of. Because you see, Zappa did work in Whitney Studios for a whole bunch of stuff. Well, Whitney Studios started off with an Electrodyne. Electrodyne is very similar to the Quad 8 that I've taken particular interest in. And I've been trying to figure out, like, okay, what does the sound signature of this desk sound like? And I thought to myself, oh, all these different things. Well, hey, it sounds a whole bunch like some of those early 70s Zappa records are like that. And I find out that Electrodyne was in Whitney Studios. And then I find out that Whitney Studios picked up a Neve, but that's Studio A. And Studio B of Whitney Studios in the early 70s still had that Electrodyne. So I got to do some comparison. I got to figure out which of these things is not like the others. Which of these things sound like what? And it is very interesting and also rather exhausting. There's a lot going in. Like I said, this is very small print. It's a giant stack of album listings. I mean, I could go through them and read them, which I'm not going to do. I've got all the way from 1966, Frank Zappa's Freak Out, Sunset Highland Studios of TTG Inc. TTG does not stand for those two guys. It stands for a Yiddish expression meaning up your ass. I got to find out where Creedence did their stuff. I never did find out what Muggles gramophone was. Joe's Garage? Well, that could easily have been a Quad 8. You Are What You is also on this list. God, sorry about that. And sometimes we know for certain. For instance, Steely Dan. Steely Dan's Can't Buy a Thrill, and most notably, Countdown to Ecstasy. Well, the Quad 8 desk is literally on the back cover of Countdown to Ecstasy. It is the recording console shown on the cover. So in that case, you know. And that's how you know that that particular location, which I think was, I'm not sure whether it says. Honestly, I don't remember what the place was, but I've been trying to track all of this stuff down. I need to move this over so I can see what's going on. And yeah, anywhere I can find what actual consoles were used for what, I can kind of run with that stuff. Like, I know Bob Olson, and so I read some of the stuff that he has to say. He's on record about how a lot of the American consoles in the early 70s were not Neves or whatever. Particular things ended up going to particular places. Let me close this. It's distracting. Quad 8. Neve, I have some of those captured to recordings now. Trident Day Range, I've actually got quite a few of those captured. That's like Damn the Torpedoes, Duty Now for the Future, Fair Warning, Goodbye Yellow Brick Road, Hockey Chateau, Nilsson Schmilsson, Off the Wall, Permanent Wave. This is one of the first ones where I was like, oh hey, I've got a bunch of these records, let's record them. I don't have any of the APIs down, but I added to that. Apostolic Studios in New York is basically where API came out of. Apostolic was a sort of freaky, funky music recording people place. They had the first 12-track studio. And Zappa's Lumpy Gravy and the Grateful Dead's Anthem of the Sun were recorded at Apostolic in New York. As was Zappa's We're Only in It for the Money, recorded at Apostolic in New York. So that is the very first inklings of API consoles. And yeah, there's a lot going on with all of this stuff. Not even getting into the old EMI consoles like Red or whatever. Also, those of you who are on my Patreon, I did not end up getting to talk to. I got caught up trying to do this research work. I did not end up talking to Vintage King. But for those of you who are dialing in to this live stream, I can confirm that it is going to be Bracasti time this month. I'll see how quickly I can make that happen. I don't see a lot of places that are like, oh, hey, we've got these in stock, here you go. But Vintage King seems to have it, so. Or Vintage King claims they can get them, so that's where I will go. And that is partly because when it comes to something that grandiose, I'm not sure if I want to go through Reverb and try to buy cheap ones off the used market. I feel as if that would be a good place for people to burn you and trick you and make you pay money for nothing. It's just the kind of gear where that's something that somebody might do. And yep, the the goal got reached. If somebody was only trying to make me do that and then cancel their stuff out, I'm not going to go back on it. But I really appreciate everybody that helped me get to that point. I don't think there's going to be any future or further goals in that sense, because the lesson I am learning from Patreon that way, like I said in the Patreon post, was apparently their records indicate that you do better when you do stuff. And here, hang on a second. Yeah, so apparently the folks at Patreon found out that you do better when you do things and just go, hey, see this thing I did, rather than making lots of elaborate promises and saying, if I get to this stage, I will do this. That apparently works so poorly that Patreon is like making people stop doing it. And so I can but comply. And the final thing that I had said was stating that I would do the Prakasti when I got to that stage. And so that is the next move, and that is going to be, I mean, I suppose I could get on the phone while on live stream. You know, give them my credit card number over the phone while streaming it. Yeah, that's going to be great. We'll do that. How about we don't? But one thing that I could do is I'm working on something else, and we're going to do some of that. So Fokomas, you might be interested in me looking up, well, let's take a moment and fool around and see what I can find here. I popped out the stream so I can, in theory, see that. I think it wants the stream to have the YouTube Studio open for that to work, but whatever. All full of typos and stuff. So interestingly, that album was a Harrison 4032 recording console, apparently. Interesting. That name hasn't even come up with me fooling around and trying to find out these things. That or a Harrison MR2. Gearspace is often a place where people talk, because one of the things about Gearspace as a large collection of forum posts is it's full of bunches of people who don't know anything, but then also some of the old timers also show up there. It's Bruce Swedian, and I do see there are some posts by Bruce Swedian, who was the person who was doing that one. And he went for a Harrison board. So that's interesting. Thriller and Bad, both on a Harrison console. Now I'm wondering what that resembles. Like, what is that like? Harrison MR2, Westlake. So this is how you find that kind of stuff out, but you can't always believe everything. And yet, yep, absolutely. That's why I'm looking at that. It can be mysterious figuring that kind of stuff out. Meanwhile, I have a private message from somebody going, can I make a cube tech? I don't know what that is, so. Somebody wants me to make a plugin mimicking a proprietary thing that other people don't want you to have. Well, I don't know. Sometimes I don't like doing stuff like that. That's a mighty small picture. That is what the Thriller desk looked like. It's not the largest picture. We'll make it a larger picture. Yeah, Thriller desk looked kind of like that. Might not have had as many might have had more channels than that. And yeah, apparently a lot of bus switching. Some people say that the filters are good. Yeah, so there you go. That is how this kind of stuff sometimes works, is you start finding out about one thing and then you find out about all these other things. Like, I'm very curious now when I start capturing records, what that's going to tell me about some of these boards on the West Coast in the 70s. Because that's the thing. Like, I now know that, what was it, Whitley Studios, that Zappa was based out of, they were on Electrodyne consoles, which are much like Quad 8. They're like film scoring consoles. It's a simpler, and it also, I mean, when I do this, I also have to look up what those particular EQ modules were that they were using, what was available at the time, because there is a great deal of significance to that. And let's talk about that a little bit, because the A range, that's a 4-band EQ, whereas the Electrodynes or the Quad 8s would tend to be 3-band. And the crossover points, those matter. The way that they behave matter. Steely Dan are like repeatedly on record about how, or people on record about how those particular desks, the ones used for Countdown to Ecstasy, the ones used for all this different stuff, possibly even the ones used for Pink Floyd's The Wall, if that really was 3 of those run together, those did not have the aggressive EQ of later stuff, edgier stuff, like, for instance, the A range. A range lets you lean on EQ bands harder. To some extent, I think Neve does as well, but that's the tricky part, because my experience of the Neve records, I mentioned somewhere that I had captured Starless and Bible Black. It's King Crimson. And that's another Neve record. And it does the thing that some of that stuff did, which is when you got the ability to do extremely extended high frequencies, people tended to use it. There was a whole discussion that went on. Somebody was asking, like, why were 80s metal bands sounding so tinny? And I got involved. This is a discussion on Reddit, in fact. And I got involved in it, and I did a little checking around. And sure enough, what happened there was the range of frequencies expanded as they went from what they were using to newer, more elaborate Neve and SSL desks and stuff like that. Well, when they went to Neve, often facilitated the use of extended high frequencies that weren't always the case with everything else, to the point where people would balance their mixes in such a way that the highs would go up higher, and then maybe in some cases the lows would go down lower, but they weren't willing to do what, say, drum and bass producers did, which was, if you're going to do subsonic lows, you have to make the space for them. The record has to be designed around them. Otherwise, all that's going to happen is you lower their frequencies down until it's no longer that sort of early 70s mid-range warmth kind of thing going on. You lower those frequencies down even further, but then you don't make them louder to compensate, and it just ends up sounding tinny. People took away the lower mids, thinking they were going to exaggerate the extended frequency range, and that's what got you changes from like going from permanent waves to signals from Rush. You'd have, and that I believe is going from A range to SSL maybe, but going from a desk that facilitated working with the mid-range and didn't exaggerate the extremes too aggressively because it sounded basically good the way it was, to other stuff that facilitated this exaggeration, and then you had to balance it. You were no longer working in mid-range as much. Instead, you're working with this wildly extended frequency range, and then you can't fit all of the bass in, but you can fit more of the treble. That does help you make things louder, but adding more bass extension does not. And yeah. So that's what I've been spending a lot of time doing, because I need to figure these things out in order to get the correct answers, in order to make the relevant plugins. And I don't mind tailoring them so that I'm calling a plugin like LA rather than calling the plugin, this is a quad 8 like it was on the wall. Because it's somewhat contentious as to whether that even was what they used on the wall. I think it sounds like it does. I think it sounds like that. But it gets really twitchy, Thinking that I was able to associate Fillmore 1971 from the Mothers with Quad 8, and then finding out that the studio he was working in picked up a Neve somewhere around that time. That's why I was going to look through the studio notes for the Zappa sessions, which I found somewhere, because there might be a reference in there. And the only thing that I do know about that is that Hot Rats was not using the Neves, because Hot Rats specifically in talk about sometimes I'm finding stuff that is like images of reprints from trade publications or like marketing articles on the various studios at the time. And so they like to do things like say, we just got in the Neve console, it's got even more channels now and stuff. And so that would show up in the trade publications of the day. And that's a more accurate reference than what people say about it now, so many years later. But then at the same time, you read the thing, or you read somebody like Gary Colgren from the Zappa team, and he'll say things like, oh yeah, they just got the Neve in just after we finished Hot Rats. That's how you know Hot Rats wasn't on the Neve, because the guy who did it was like, oh yeah, they got this after we finished this album of ours. And then it just becomes a matter of like, I can find the sound of those early Neves. Yes's Fragile and Close to the Edge were done on early Neves like that. I can, to some extent, work out what the sound signature of those things are. It's not incredibly different from the American sound of the quad eights. So I just got to capture this stuff and start going, A-Bing them, listening to them after having recorded it and edited out some of the clicks and pops and things that I get off of these vinyl records. And then listen to it on proper monitoring for all the things that will tell me what's what. Because there's a very distinctive sound for each of these things. And for Air Studios, Neve. And that means that the first Pretenders album, that's a Neve sound. Pink Floyd's Metal, that's if I'm remembering correctly, that is also a Neve sound. As was Wish You Were Here. Wish You Were Here, although it was in Abbey Road Studios, was not on a TG-12345. It wasn't on an EMI console because they'd bounced away from that EMI console for Metal, and then obscured by clouds, something else. I think it might have been Neve, but they got back into Abbey Road when they had enough channels to work with. And there is specific mention about how they hated working on the Neve for Wish You Were Here because it was a pain in the butt to work on compared with what they already had been used to before. I don't know exactly why it was a pain in the butt, but they did not like this Neve. They thought that it was cumbersome or something about it was not working for them. But it might have been just the fact that they were miserable at the time. But there are things like that where we know that the classic EMI console is the Dark Side of the Moon console. And I think it is really very likely that I used to think, Adam Hart Mother or Ummagumma would be putting up mics in a hall, like it's an audience recording. I am not nearly so sure of that. When I re-listen to it, I start hearing stuff coming off of Ummagumma that sounds very much like the kinds of sounds that come off of Dark Side of the Moon. I think that is a live performance that was captured to I don't know how many tracks, and then to some extent reconstructed in the studio. After all, half of Ummagumma is a studio album, and this is in the time period where that Abbey Road TG-12345 console was ruling the roost over there. So the stuff during that time period, and it hangs together because you listen to it and you go, okay, that is that sort of dark, full, kind of receding sound. And it's not the edgier, brighter sound of the Neves that did the Yes albums after Time and a Word. The Yes album with Starship Troopers, etc., and Fragile, of course, and then Close to the Edge. All of those were done on Neves, and although Fragile is not as bright as the other two, they have the same characteristic of that. In particular, the Yes album, it's easily as bright and sparkly as Wish You Were Here. And it's the same time period, and it's the same, Neve was making consoles, and they had only so many things preamps and EQs and stuff. And if you got a Neve console, you got that kind of stuff, and it did what it did. This was not an era where people were mixing and matching preamps on things. This was an era of we got the studio, and we're working with the studio. Except for in California, they bounced around among a cajillion different studios quite often. So just stuff gets really complicated. And yeah, that is frustrating, but it is also obviously fascinating. And it's just kind of, it's fun and distracting in this weird way to grovel through just all of this stuff, looking for the technical details, digging through old records and looking for what is written on them. You know, apostolic, okay, that means pre-API even existed in New York. They had 12 tracks in New York. These folks, they went to New York to do the recording. Certain other things in Los Angeles, you're probably talking quad 8s and electrodynes and things like that. And you know, there was another note in there somewhere. I'm not going to look it up right now. So it's just trying to find all of that information. Finding out things like, you know, although Damn the Torpedoes was tracked in Sound City, you have to give it to Cherokee for mixing. And that is because Shelley Yakis, who did the mixing, specifically was in Sound City on the Neve. On the Neve they had there. The Sound City Neve, the one that Dave Grohl did an entire movie about. And then I'm going to be looking into and trying to add some examples of that, examples of stuff coming off of Sound City. Well, for Damn the Torpedoes, they tracked all of that stuff on the Neve. And the Neve is darn good at tracking things. But when it came down to mixing the stuff down, Shelley wasn't able to get the bass that he wanted out of it. He kept having to add bass. He did not like the way that he could get bass out of that. And if you think about it, like, well, you've got those Yes albums also on a Neve. They're not necessarily the most humongous bass you're ever going to find. Similarly with Wish You Were Here. Wish You Were Here is not a heavy bass album. Now, Pink Floyd's Metal is kind of a heavy bass album on the side 2 track Echoes, but it's in a weird way. It struggles to do the super subterranean bass. They clearly messed around and did weird things with it. They were cranking the controls as far as they could go, and that is on a Neve. But it's also doing who knows what else. Apparently they were just struggling to make it work. Well, when Tom Petty and the Heartbreakers were doing Damn the Torpedoes, they evidently ran into the same problem. They did not want a bass like classic Yes albums, where that's kind of mid-rangey. There's a lot of focus, there's a lot of clarity, but it's not a giant pile of mud. And they did not want that. They did not intend to try to do the whatever Pink Floyd did on Metal, to get the bass on Echoes to be huge when they needed it. And so Shelley Yakis was trying to do Damn the Torpedoes on a Neve, and he struggled so hard that he refused to do it on the Neve, and they moved to Cherokee, and Cherokee is known to have trident A ranges. And so Shelley Yakis took Damn the Torpedoes away from the Neve. Oh, thank you, Dave Robertson. Away from the Neve, and put it on to the one where, like, David Bowie did Station to Station, Van Halen did Fair Warning, etc., so that he could push the bass to make the bass do what he wanted it to do. And this is what I look at when I'm, like, getting into doing these lettered versions of console. Like, for instance, if I am doing a version of console that'll be console LA, the console that's meant to sound like quad 8s and electrodynes, the one that'll have those frequencies and those crossovers. And yeah, the struggle with bass is not that different between those and the old Neves, for instance. And they both have really extended highs, but I think they are expressed differently. Like the Neve extended highs are like detail and texture. If that makes any sense. like you think about the guitars on Close to the Edge. You think about some of the guitar sounds on Pretenders. There's a lot of Jeff Beck albums. Those Neve highs are very textural, but then if I'm correctly associating some of that 70s, and I know that I am associating some of that 70s Frank Zappa stuff with Quad 8, or indeed Electrodyne, rather than Neve, those have sonority and projection beyond what the Neves will typically do. To the point where Bob Olson is on record as saying, yeah, back when we were working in the 70s, we considered the Quad 8s and the Electrodynes to be better. We did not think that the Neves were as good. They were a step lower as far as we were concerned. And that was Bob, who was working at Motown at the time. And I think Motown was among the folks that were getting Quad 8s and Electrodynes in those American consoles of the time. But yeah, you would run into that when you were working with acts. Like, my touchstone for that stuff is like Flo and Eddie from the 1970s Zappa, the early Zappa, where you got like 200 Motels, you got Mothers at the Fillmore in 71, and that's the thing, is for those particular albums, well, the Whitney Studios, or I'm pretty sure that's what it was, they got in a Neve, but they moved the original board to Studio B. And I don't know, although I'm going to be trying to find in some kind of reference on those Zappa track lists that I found somehow. Somebody had made notes of like, on this day they were working on this song in the studio. I want to find out whether they were doing the mixing in Studio A or Studio B. If they were doing the mixing in Studio A, it meant it's a Neve record. If they were doing the mixing in Studio B, that is an Electrodyne record. And people don't necessarily recognize those. But it seems to me that if those are the ones that provide, like Flo and Eddie harmonizing, because 200 Motels was mixed at Whitney Sound. That at least is confirmed. I just don't know which studio he was in. And I don't know whether he shared Bob Olson's opinion that the new Neve was all fine and well, but if he had a choice, he would go to Studio B because that's where they had the Electrodyne that he was used to working with because he worked with it on Hot Rats and so on and so forth. Yeah. So, a lot of work. Any case, I wanted to get a little bit of this done while I was at it, so we're going to do some of that. I am doing Purist Console 3, and I'll tell you why. Purist Console 3, when I set that up, is for having the upgrades to the sine algorithm that I worked out that use the shifting of bits technology I go on about. I know I've got that information available, and Purist Console is just literally sine, arcsine. And then Purist Console 2 is subtly filtered sine, arcsine. But I need to make a stripped down, simpler version of Purist Console, which is going to be 3, because I recommended to somebody that if they wanted to do a console mix, but they wanted to use all of that oversampling stuff because those are the sounds they care about, they should be using the original Purist console because it doesn't have any type of filtering. It's like bring your own filtering or processing. And it's also very simple in every other way. So, making a Purist Console 3 will be making an even more lightweight, presumably, version of the processing. And that means that you can put it into oversampling and then do that. And if that's the way, if people hear different things, they really hear different things as far as sound is concerned. And just because I'm running with the shifting bit stuff, just because I'm trying to maximize the under processing, and that's certainly what's going to happen with these named versions of console that emulate giant analog desks. I'm going to be doing that in a minimalist way. That's going to draw heavily on everything that I've learned from Console 0, because I surprised myself with what Console 0 did to the sound. It really got to a point where I was like, oh hey, I'm getting an Eevee vibe off of this, what the heck? That worked. And so I went, well, now what does this teach me? And if I have to make much more complicated processing, I might be able to run with that, particularly with some of the things that I'm able to do. And use the minimalist thing in there so that I can simplify how all that stuff works. But that's still going to be purist, that's still going to be Console 0 style. That's not going to directly address the needs of people who their ears dial in to aliasing beyond anything else, and they apparently don't hear quantization at all. I don't know why, it jumps out very big to me, but they hear aliasing super easy. Well, that's the thing, is people hear so differently that I need to try to support that. So I advised publicly that if you needed to do that, you should be using Purist Console, the original, not the follow-up, and just take that and put it into as much oversampling as you want. You know, do extra oversampling for a final render, all that kind of stuff that normally doesn't work with my stuff. That's when you should use it. And so if I do Purist Console 3, it will be a distinct sound that mimics what the changes I've made are. And it'll also be a way for me to refer to that as well, because I mean I can refer to the algorithm in Console 0 easily enough. I can refer to the algorithm in Purist Console, which is sine going into arc sine. But then if I can swap those things out, that means I can start putting together mixing desks and combining stuff like the EQs I've been working on recently with versions of these variations on console so that I can hear what sounds more like a TG12345 or what sounds more like a Trident Day range. I'll try to identify the tone of each of these things so that I can select what works correctly for a given output. Like it's not necessarily going to be the same thing for the TG12345 as it would be for an Eve. Those are going to act a little different as far as the summing buses and so on are concerned. And yeah. So I got a question from Rebane here. So Rebane, interestingly enough, and I don't actually know what cryo chamber stuff is, but I do take an interest in ambient music. It would depend a little bit on how deep you want it to be. I often like ambient music to be pretty deep. I like to have a lot of space in it. It needs to extend way back rather than just grinding at your ears all the time. Honestly, I think that Console Zero does a pretty good job with that stuff. I'd have to hear more about your examples to really know. Console Zero should do a good job of combining field recordings. That said, if you needed to do fades and changes and things, you'd have to do something in addition. For instance, like throw in purist fade, for instance. That will give you very smooth volume shifts. And yeah, that will probably work better for you than some of the other options. Something like people get very excited about Console 8, but I believe that is because I am doing more as far as getting a large format analog console style sound in Console 8 than I ever did before. It has processing of various kinds, like high passing on multiple stages and slew restriction going on. It's really working at trying to sound like an analog desk is Console 8. And that might not work as well with your ambient stuff. It might not work as well with your field recordings. Those might lend themselves more to being summed through something like Purist Console or Console Zero. So there is your recommendation. Now, where I was at with this. I'm going to go and find what numbers I need to use for these things. Here we go. I need ID numbers. So, Purist Chancel, Purist PCOC is what this is. So what did I call 2? I'm looking for similarities. PCOE, so I'm incrementing the final letter. Okay. So where'd that take me? And I believe the reason for that is because if I have something like Purist Console Bus and Purist Console Channel, I can call them PCOB and PCOC, respectively. And that kind of makes sense. But then when I do another version, rather than having it be PC2 channel and bus, sometimes I would go through and change the last digit. So it became E and presumably D. Let's find out. Because I got to get them right. If these numbers intersect with each other, it causes problems. This is one of those things where I have to get it right or I have just endless headaches that I can't deal with. D and E. So F and G will be the next ones. Let's open the channel as well. Close this thing. Alrighty. Came back to here. D. E. B becomes F. Becomes F. I apologize for how stuff disintegrates into me kind of babbling, but when I'm trying to figure these things out, often I stop making sense. D, E, F, and G. So C being after B becomes F and G as follows. P, C, O, G. B to F, C to G. If that didn't make any sense, well, I have to get it right. So unfortunately, even if it doesn't make any sense, I do still have to understand it. And this will provide me with a simple thing. And I got to go back into, I'm not sure whether I'm wanting purest channel 2 or purest channel 1 as a basis for this. Let's go and see what they're like. In the bus, I'm not necessarily going to have any kind of fader on there at all, but the channel, on the other hand, might. So there's my 1 biquad filter. We're not going to have that. And it seems as if we're doing it pretty direct, aren't we? So there we are. There is our code for the sine. It is in fact clipped. I do not remember if the original was, so let's find out. It will not matter. Yeah, the original does not even clip at max overload. The original wraps. The original will wave shape if you want it to. If that's the word. Where it's not the word. What do those Eurorack modules do when you frequency double or multiply in order to do West Coast synthesis? I know it's not wave shape, it's something else. Trying to remember what the thing is that you do. Fracture, my plugin Fracture does this. And it's not wave shape because it's like a frequency multiplier. If you run a frequency into it intensely enough, you start getting doublings and multiplyings and stuff. Oh, now it's driving me crazy. What the hell is it? Let's look it up on the internet and find out. I guess they do call it wave shaping. Why, shucks. It is indeed non-linear wave shaping, that's for sure. Okay, good enough. Would have sworn it wasn't actually called wave shaping. I'll tell you what. Let's open up a different thing now that we know that this does wave shaping rather than simple clipping. We're not going to use that. We're going to use something else. And close these things up. And I don't know, I'll close those up too, because I'm looking for something else. Close everything. It's going to be this one, this test console one, where I'm looking for what I need. And that is this code at the bottom here. That's because this is my crude sine, crude arc sine, and so on. Here, I'll share the information. So we're trying to build stuff out of this. Not only that, I'm going to go another level. This crude sine and crude arc sine is, in fact, the real numbers. But what I'm looking for also is the optimization. And I had it somewhere and I don't remember where. Dang it. Maybe I've got it in the code for a fat EQ. This is my test bed for doing the EQs for those things. Those things meaning future versions of console. So we got biquads and stuff. Do we have footnotes at the bottom? Nope. We've got strictly sine and cosine based calculations here, so that's not what I was looking for either. So probably what I should do is look into what I just did, console 0. Maybe that's where I'll find it. I bet it is. I bet that's where I'll find it. If not, I will know by looking. So there's console 0 bus and console 0 channel. Now let's see. Okay, so here's the problem. Console 0 is too simple of a form. I need to try a little harder. It is so simple that it's barely even a sine, much less an arc sine. We don't want that. Let's open these. Oh God, can't open that. Move out of the way, you. And that's how we opened that. Again, great apologies if I sound like a babbling fool. Sometimes that's going to happen because I'm doing this while my head is full of like Trident A-range EQ configurations and stuff, and I'm just trying to make sense of it all. Hello. There's it. There it is. See? I got there. What I had was waiting for me to use. It's right there. See where it says crude sine and crude arc sine? That's the real numbers for doing the calculation correctly. And see where it says divided by 6, divided by 120, divided by 5040, divided by 362,880. Those are the real numbers for approximating a sine or an arc sine out to multiple waveforms, but we're just making a nonlinear taper here, so what we're going to do is what I have here. This is that only worked out in such a way that it's being done entirely in a single operation. It's a single line of code, and it is doing a sine or an arc sine approximation. But you'll notice that all of the divides in things are factors of 2. 128, 262, 144, 8, 496, 4, 8, 16, 32. These are all factors of 4. They're divides, and so they are shifting bits. We're using shifting bits even on this. But unlike what's in console 0, because console 0 is one stage of this processing, this is basically 4 to try to get the pseudo sine more accurate, except for now it's using shiftings of bits, and so it's not more accurate because it's intentionally choosing stuff to retain the mantissa a little better. And we've got to see whether that is going to work and be helpful. Probably also got to build in at least one. Does Purist Console have a gain control? I feel like maybe that's not what that's about, and maybe what I should do is leave that off. Do I have Purist Console channel open? No. Can I open it? Yes. I was looking for it in the old files. P. So there's where you would want to have a gain control, but I think I might have left it off. Yup. So part of the idea for Purist Console is that you will do your gain controlling before it, as usual, but you'll do it with another plugin. It is just only the processing. So we will continue that. We will follow it through. It'll be another faceless one. And close these. Meaning we're going to go through and start deleting all of this stuff because there won't be any controls. Okay, number of parameters, 0. But we do the dithering. None of this relates anymore. Nor does this. If it gets anything, it returns as invalid parameter. Just making sure those are right. See, these brackets are a little weird. That one should sit there. And I'm going to leave that alone. Let's not worry about that right now. Better take some of these long doubles out, make them be regular doubles. Or take that out entirely because we don't need to do anything like that. And a double will suffice. I have tested this, I know. And we are doing console, so boop. Interestingly, this means we have the capacity to do it exactly the way that Purist Console did it, which means that it will wrap. It will not clip to a point. If you drive too far, it'll start wave shaping on you. I think maybe that's okay. Fewer stuff to do. Let's see if this builds. Well, it won't build the first time. These things I'm working with, you got to build it once, and only then can it find its reference files. He's compiling that stuff that it needed now, after it tried using it. And the second time around, just fine. So we finished that. Same deal. I gotta say, it will be very interesting to try to compare these with, for instance, the algorithm from out at console 0. I might even do a test bed thing where I just can switch around among these things in order to monitor it more effectively. Perhaps not right at the moment, but there we are. These will go away, no controls on these. Got a little space in there that didn't belong. And the spacing of my stuff is not very good, but that's probably harmless. See, like, you don't have to have these many spaces in here. Often I like to leave that stuff the way that it is because regularity in the code is often a good thing. In fact, let's undo that change. And then redo that delete. And then leave the rest of it alone so that for the most part, if anybody needed to do a search for result kaudio error invalid parameter bracket return tab return result, the number of my plugins that have that would probably be fairly extensive because this is like boilerplate code. I'll have that be the way that it normally is. This stuff needs to go away. Go away stuff. And here is the converse. No dry sample. No need for a long double. It is just possible that I might try that again for certain of the named consoles. That said, I'm fairly hesitant about that. I mean, I really found out double got you there. So I'd need to be pretty convinced that I needed to do something extra fancy for it. That or, I don't know, try to identify something about it. Let's not talk about that when we're trying to do this. Same deal, 2 builds. The first one doesn't work because it's busy trying to compile stuff that needed to refer to before it did the initial compilation, and that's why it had problems. It finishes, and the second time around, the stuff that it needed to compile in the first place will be there, and it will be fine. Or if it wasn't, I'd find out about it real quick. Alrighty. Now to start closing various windows and things and grabbing my audio. I may celebrate my birthday by not streaming all the way until 1 o'clock. I've given you all the good reverb, and if this succeeds, this will be a nice little thing to do. There will be no further use of this, so I'll be done. So I might as well copy it over. Option. Components. I'll need to do VSTs, but that's another story. Might be able to do that later in the week. Perhaps. So there's the bus. Same deal, option drag. Because these are final. There's so little to them that there shouldn't be anything to do. How odd. That was a sound inside the laptop that I just heard. It was trying to actuate the CD player for some reason. I don't know why. Let's put that back. I was afraid I was going to drop it inside one of the other Mac AUs. Let's not do that. And yes, I will return to 2tape7. You can see 2tape7 on this screen. Well, you could if you were looking very closely. And lastly, what can we open or investigate? Now, one of the things that I mentioned in the Patreon thing, and if anybody has hung out with me this long into a live stream, I can mention that to you as well, is that the thing I've been pointing to, Analog Me 75, is in fact a website. And if you go there, you can download this file that I'm working with and use it for your own stuff. This is the Rise original drums track. A 96K recording done in my studio. So what we'll do is open up one of my effects stacks, that being console test, I think. And I'm going to add the ones I just did and resave it. No controls. And no controls. And there they is. And there is span. So what I'll do is I'm going to load up a sine wave, but as a bit of a reference, if we did Purist Console 2 channel, slight boost, 3 channel, 0 channel, or indeed the bus versions, that's console 0. Let's stop with that for the moment and move these around until they make a kind of sense. Or you try to achieve sense. Oh, dropped it. Dropped it. Where did I drop it? So got the list of consoles here. Here, you can see it. 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, all that stuff. So what I was fixing to do was set this up so that they were in 1, 2, and 3 order down here, and then we're going to save it again. Close out the stack and that, because it wasn't really what I wanted. And let's just load up a sine wave, because a sine wave will show us what's going on. Here's one. It's a rather low frequency note, but it is a sine. I think my microphone is turned up on the little the ATEM. It's okay, I can just, I'll talk in a chill and mellow voice and that'll work out. When I had it turned down, I felt I had to raise my voice or shout too much. Back to effect stacks. Let us see whether we have the magics going and what we got. I feel like if this is a successful thing, I will go from there. So, there is our waveform. If we did Purist Console, there's the channel plugin, and there's the bus plugin. Sine followed by arc sine completely removes the harmonic again. console 2, there's the sine being applied, and here is the arc sine. Same thing. Now when we compare that to console 0 channel, console 0 channel has many more harmonics, and console 0 bus, the way this is set up, it's taking out that first one, but it's still leaving a bunch of the other ones because it is that kind of nonlinear. People are loving the sound of this, but know that it does throw a bunch of harmonics. You're not seeing that much in the way of weird aliasing. Whereas if we did things like, for instance, the old console 4, that's a really striking harmonic, and then when you put the bus on, it's got a bunch of harmonics for some reason. Or when we did console 6, that's supposed to be a reversible one, that has a bunch of harmonics too. But it's much better at reversing them. So there's a possibility of stuff that can be used. And then your console 7, and console 7 bus kind of went back to having stuff. Yeah, well, thank you, Gomez. So, purest console 3 channel, where our real sine looks like this. So you got the third harmonic, then you got a fifth harmonic. And it is at, let's call that 98.6 body temperature dB. Purest console 3 channel isn't quite the same, and so it is 99.2 dB. The fifth harmonic is slightly fainter than with a real live sine. And then when we throw the simulated arc sine, hey presto, guess what? Now it's not actually taking those away in the way that the original one does, it's changing them. We got 53. And that is a distinct tonal coloration. Compare it to like the way that purest console cancels out. But then that third harmonic is like 50 dB. Or if we were doing only the arc sine, doing only the arc sine gives you this. Doing only the purest console 3 arc sine gives you this. So it's the same type of processing, 45 dB down to 51 dB. Like it's the same type of processing, being a saturate and then an anti-saturate. I can even demonstrate that. Kind of no reason not to, as long as I have the screen up, as long as I am finishing up my stream with illustrations of these things. So if we apply purest console 3 channel to all of this, we don't really see much of a change to the sine wave, but it is flattening it. And what we can do to make this more obvious is make that sine louder. If we do that, then the effect that we're having with this stuff is going to be way more striking. So let's see what we got, because it should be about the same behavior, even though it's being exaggerated. There's our sine, it's way louder. Purest console, overtone. You'll notice that even as loud as this, our overtone is still not throwing a huge range. It's like third, fifth, and then a little bit of seventh harmonic. And then you undo it and it puts it back. Whereas if we were doing only arc sine, well, now we're having a whole bunch of funny behavior. Purist Console 3 channel. That's fairly chill. It's not that different from Purist Console channel. And then we add the bus, and now we're hearing more of an effect. But if we didn't have the encoding there, it would be even more striking. But you'll notice that if we were going back and forth between a real arc sine and the imitation arc sine, real arc sine is throwing more harmonics. Imitation arc sine has the harmonics very much redistributed. In fact, the imitation arc sine at a note like this is not throwing any harmonics that are high enough to alias. The real thing will cause more aliasing than the simplified version that I did. And then when you do both of them, we've got this going on. And again, it's throwing kind of similarly to if we do our console 0, which is even more radical. It has that roll off at the top there. But it's throwing a range of harmonics that die away faster than, say, if we had the arc sine going on. And what I said I was going to do was first demonstrate the console 3 channel. You see it's flattened off the tops of the wave a little bit. And then go back into here into the console 3 bus. And the console 3 bus has quite radically spiked up the peaks. This started out as a simple sine wave, but now it looks just like a triangle wave, at least by visual inspection. And then lastly, when we do what you're supposed to, which is run both. Purist Console 3 channel. And if I did this on just original Purist Console, you would literally get exactly the same thing out that you started with. But this is no longer like that, so instead you get actually a kind of expanded one. We're peaking a little hotter than we otherwise would. We're peaking at 1.27, so this system is not as linear as it might be. Since we've already changed this, let's go and change it some more. And hey, if it was peaking at 1.27, let's subtract that and see where we get. And then we go back in. Note that I'm not treating this as, oh, it gave me the wrong number and therefore I must fix it. I want to see what it's doing. And now we have Purist Console 3 channel and bus. When we do both of those, it is now acting still a lot like a sine. But remember how our waveform in the frequency analyzer showed some harmonics? What that means is that, and it doesn't come quite up to 0, but it comes pretty close. Purist Console 3 is not exactly the same in sound or in behavior as the original Purist Console. That one is literally sine backed by arc sine, and it produces no harmonics and it does no changes. This is not the same as that, but that is not to say that this works out to be the same as a simple saturator. In fact, I think it might be doing just a hint of expandiness on the sound. So if you were using it, you'd be able to put as much oversampling as you wanted into it. Because, yeah, that's the deal. The reason I'm putting this out is so that it will make oversampling available for people who want to use that in their sounds. But then you're also going to get that little hint of additional harmonics of something else beyond what you would have, and I think it's going to open up the sound a little bit compared to just regular old digital summing. I think that's the way this one kind of balances out. And that is not to say that I couldn't, for instance, go into, say, Purist Console 3 channel, which is, this is my crude sine algorithm. So we're adding these things and subtracting these things, and that's how you approximate it. But supposing I took this and instead of being 4096, I used something else, like 8192 or whatever I think that's what it would be. Then it would be taking the this additional factor and having it be slightly less, and it would alter to some extent the types of harmonics I was getting, like how that stuff was working out. Or this one, this is, plus input sample to the power of 9 divided by this very, very large number. I could take it one step down, and then I would be doing a much more powerful subtracting for sort of peak volume levels. All in all, there are many alterations that can be done with this. This is simply the crude sine approximation that is adjusted so that it will use bit shifting for these internal calculations. And I use sines and arcsines and things quite a lot. Hey, Lorenzo. So, all in all, I think that ends up being a pretty good day of coding. And I think that people are going to be able to use Purist Console. I will describe it as it is, which is, if you want a really, really accurate version of what Console does, you can use the original Purist Console. It is the simplest form of that process. Let's not save this. And if you're looking for something that has maybe a little bit more character, a little bit more of a sound, or something that presumably, because I'm assuming that what with replacing the real, this is me basically replacing various things like the real numbers that you would use to even approximate a sine correctly with shifting of bits, which will lead to it being calculated quicker. So if somebody was like oversampling stuff to 768K on a plugin by plugin basis, and they tried first Purist Console channel and then Purist Console 3 channel, they would probably find they would be able to oversample it higher using Purist Console 3 than with the original one, depending upon just how effective the computer is at doing stuff that's covered in the basic math library. Because there's a trade-off there. On the one hand, if there's fancy things in place to let you do sines and arcsines insanely quickly, so it's just kind of like looking up the value and being like, okay, we're done. We don't have to calculate anything. We're just looking it up. If you're doing that, then Purist Console would run faster. But if it's not doing that, and if it's actually having to do the math to do a good job of making an actual sine, well, the replacement that I've just done is not exactly the same, but boy, is it more efficient. It's doing relatively little to get its result, and then some of the intermediate stages that it does, and I don't know whether it would be able to do like input sample multiplied by itself X number of times in order to like use what it got at one stage for one part of the calculation and then continue doing it in order to get the, because it's built up out of input sample multiplied by itself 3 times, or 5 times, or 7 times, or 9 times. In theory, you could write a whole pile of code with additional variables and things just to save calculations along the line so that you could use them. But in modern computers, they're more willing to do math calculations than they are to store additional numbers. So when I discovered that I could rephrase that stuff as just the number we're already using. Oh, I better know what's happening. I'm getting bothered by text messages. I'm about ready to be done streaming. Not only that, it's spam. This is why I keep my phone on airplane mode all the time. I keep my phone in airplane mode because I can't cope with the distraction of being constantly badgered with boner pills. Anyways, where was I? Input sample being multiplied by itself 9 times. Yeah, the thing is that since modern computers are more willing to do a lot of math operations than they are to store variables along the way in the belief that caching intermediate calculations is going to be more efficient, that being able to describe that stuff as, yeah, we're just taking this one variable and doing 4 different subcalculations on it and assigning it to itself as a result. Meaning that you got to do everything first before you can apply the result, but also meaning all of the things that we're doing are with the one variable. We never even have to generate another variable. It's all being done within sort of the calculation zone. That probably means that modern processors are able to do lots of stuff with that. And I could put pretty much any amount of sine or arcsine calculations into code, which is kind of handy considering that all of my EQ stuff, all the boost stuff is based on sine calculations. So I might very well want to re-examine some of that. I was not able to do an approximation for cosine, sadly. Cosine is what I'm using for cuts on the EQ. Like the, what have I got here that I can show that on? I can show that on like my Discord welcome home. Yeah, when I'm talking about cosines, what I mean is that I can do this. So when the stuff is flat, and this is a 4-band EQ, or boosted, everything steps into the sine calculation thing. Whereas if we do cuts, I'm using a cosine calculation on the cuts, meaning that a lot of the quieter sounds just end up dropping to 0, but our louder sounds still poke through, and that helps me get the tone out of this thing that I need to get. So boost on the highs, cuts on all the mids, boost on the bass. We'll cut on the highs and mids. Or heck, cuts on everything, why not? Boosts on only the low mids. This is all playing very loudly into the room. So I only have my optimizations for sines and arcsines. I don't have them for cosines, and all my cuts here are cosines. Which is not to say that maybe I won't investigate it more and find a way of doing it. I just haven't yet. And I have for the sines and arcsines. And so probably not right away, but I will be putting out the plugin that I just did the initial stages on namely Purist Console 3. You just saw the kinds of harmonics it produces. We have not actually heard it in the same way that you were able to hear Console 0, because I did a video with it in the mix. Honestly, what I should probably do is well, no, I can't do that, can I? I was going to say, like, do it and swap out Console 0, but unfortunately I don't actually have. Although I do have, I could simply reproduce what I do in Console 0 in bit shift pan, and then throw Purist Console 3. And the nice thing is, since it's shifting of bits, the stages in that are so coarse that it would give me exactly the same result. So maybe I'll do that. Maybe I will use the pan version to replicate what I did in the mix of Console 0, and then throw Purist Console 3 on the end of that, and then we'll have some comparison files to play with, like different renderings. I can run it through on the original Purist console, and then you can hear the difference between that and the new hotness of Purist Console 3 and the Console 0 algorithm. I don't know. We'll see. Anyways, I'm going to call that a day. I say I have done the plugin. I have an idea for how I can do these comparison files that I'd like to do, and that ought to do it. I do need to make the VST versions of all of this, and then port them all to the modern version, and then have them be signed plugins and all of that, all the 9 yards, and the Linux versions and the Windows versions for these two new Purist console things. But I've been doing that for years, so don't worry about it. I got it covered. But yeah, I will talk to you folks later. I'm going to go and chill. And see you next week. See you when I probably bring out, I think it's going to be, let's do Star Child 2. For those who stuck around for the end of the stream, now you know what's going to come out next week. See you later. And bye-bye.